The city below was a living thing, a low, constant hum of engines and distant sirens that was the price of this view. From the 62nd floor, the chaos of the streets softened into a silent, glittering tapestry. David Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, a cup of brutally expensive, perfectly black coffee growing cool in his hand. He wasn't seeing the postcard-perfect vista of Central Park, a green blanket spread out in the morning mist. He was seeing spreadsheets, projections, and the stubborn, skeptical face of a board member from Tokyo, whose agreement he needed in precisely 47 minutes. His home was a monument to success, but also to silence. Polished concrete floors echoed. The furniture was all severe angles, and imported Italian leather, beautiful but cold. The only thing that seemed to hold any warmth was the single, incongruous object in the center of the formal living room, a grand piano. A Steinway Model B, ebony black, its lid propped open like a giant sleeping wing. It was a piece bought on the advice of an interior designer who said it added soul. David couldn't play a note. It was, for him, a sculpture. A very expensive, very silent sculpture. He turned from the window, his Italian loafers making no sound on the thick rug. He had a ritual before high-stakes calls, 5 minutes of absolute quiet, rehearsing his opening lines in his head. He settled into the command chair behind his desk, a monolithic thing of brushed steel and dark oak, and closed his eyes. The city's hum was a familiar white noise. The gentle whoosh of the climate control. The almost imperceptible tick of a minimalist clock on the far wall. Then, it came dotted first. It was so faint he thought he'd imagined it. A ghost of a melody, weaving through the mechanical sounds of the building. He opened his eyes, frowning. It wasn't the elevator. It wasn't a radio from a nearby apartment. There were no nearby apartments. He held his breath there. Again, a single clean note, hanging in the air like a drop of water. Then another. And then a cascade of them, spilling into the silence not as a jaunty tune, but as something deep, sorrowful, and breathtakingly complex. It was piano music, but unlike any he'd ever heard in a hotel lobby or at a charity gala. This had weight. It had a story in every chord. It felt like a heartbreaking, translated directly into sound. His first, absurd thought was that he'd left the speaker on. Some high-end audio system playing a recording. But the sound was too present. It had a physicality to it, the slight vibration of a hammer striking a string right here, in this space. It was coming from the living room. A spike of irrational annoyance shot through him. Someone was in his home. Someone was touching his piano. His immediate instinct was to storm in, to protect his property, to fire whoever had dared. He was a man used to controlling every variable in his environment. This was an invasion, but as he rose from his chair, the music swelled. It pulled at him. It was so profoundly sad, and yet so beautiful, that it stopped him in his tracks just outside his study door. He found himself moving not with the anger of a property owner, but with the caution of someone approaching a wild, delicate creature. He moved silently down the short hallway, the rich carpet swallowing his footsteps. The door to the grand living room was slightly ajar. The music was clearer now, pouring through the gap. It was a classical piece. He knew that much. It rolled and tumbled, passages of soft, whispering melody giving way to powerful emotional surges. He paused, his hand on the cool wood of the door. He leaned, just enough to see a sliver of the room, and there she was, Maria. He almost didn't recognize her. She was framed by the massive window, the morning light catching dust motes that danced around her like fairies. She was perched on the very edge of the piano bench, her posture not one of relaxed playing, but of intense, total focus. Her usually practical, tied-back hair had a few strands loose, falling across her forehead. Her eyes were closed. Her hands, The hands he'd only ever seen wearing yellow rubber gloves, buried in soapy water, or carefully polishing the very wood of this piano, were now flying over the keys. They weren't just hitting notes. They were speaking. Her fingers, which looked ordinary, even slightly worn from work, now possessed a graceful, powerful life of their own. They leapt, they caressed, they struck with decisive force. Then, soft to a touch so gentle it seemed impossible, David felt the air leave his lungs. Maria, his housekeeper. The quiet, efficient woman who came every Tuesday and Friday like clockwork. She spoke in soft, accented sentences, always polite, always asking where to focus her efforts. She was invisible in the best way, leaving his world impeccably clean and ordered before vanishing again. He knew she was from Eastern Europe somewhere, that she had a son in college. That was the extent of it. She was a function, a service. The woman at the piano was not a function. She was an artist, a maestro. A wave of heat flushed up his neck to his cheeks. He felt like a voyeur, witnessing something profoundly private. This wasn't a performance for him. It was a conversation she was having with the music, with the instrument, with some memory or feeling deep inside her that this job, this life, usually kept locked tight. The expression on her face was one of both deep pain and profound release. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she didn't break rhythm. Her hands continuing their heartbreaking dance. For 3 full minutes, David Vance, billionaire, stood frozen in the shadow of the hallway, completely forgotten. The board meeting in Tokyo, the coffee, the spreadsheets, all of it evaporated. The only real thing in the universe was this secret concert in the morning light. The piece began to draw to a close, the notes becoming slower, more spaced apart, each one a final, weighted thought. The last note hung in the air, a vibration that seemed to linger in the very bones of the apartment, long after the sound had faded. Maria's shoulders slumped, the energy draining from her. She let out a long, slow breath she seemed to have been holding for the whole piece. She opened her eyes, staring at the keys, and in that unguarded moment, David saw a flood of emotions cross her face. A wistful sadness, a flicker of pride, and then, swiftly, a mask of practical worry. She glanced, almost guiltily, at the antique clock on the mantel. Quickly, she pulled a soft cloth from the pocket of her simple, clean apron, the same cloth she used for dusting, and gave the keys a few tender wipes as if apologizing for her intrusion. She adjusted the bench perfectly back to its original position, stood up, and smoothed down her apron. In seconds, the transcendent artist was gone, replaced once more by the quiet, efficient housekeeper. She turned to leave the room, and David, his heart pounding strangely in his chest, jerked back from the door. He moved with a speed and silence he didn't know he possessed, retreating back into his study. He heard the soft click of the living room door closing, and a moment later, the distant, familiar sound of the vacuum cleaner starting up in the guest bedroom wing. He sank into his desk chair, staring at nothing. The call to Tokyo was forgotten. All he could see were those hands, those flying, speaking hands, where he had only ever seen a cleaning cloth. The disconnect was so vast, it was dizzying. Who was this woman? How could such world-class talent be hiding inside his quiet, unassuming housekeeper? Why was she here, cleaning his toilets and dusting his shelves, when she could clearly be on a stage? The mystery completely consumed him. The polished, controlled surface of his world had just developed a deep, fascinating crack, and from it, something astonishing and real had poured out. He knew, with a certainty that was as unsettling as it was exciting, that he could not pretend he hadn't seen it. The silent piano in the other room was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a question. And David Vance, a man who had built an empire on solving complex problems, now had a new, deeply human puzzle to solve. The familiar morning sounds felt different now. The hiss of the espresso machine, the distant groan of the elevator, they were just a backdrop to the new soundtrack playing in David's head. The haunting melody from the piano had taken up permanent residence there, a constant echo in the quiet spaces between his thoughts. He'd gone through the Tokyo call on autopilot, his mind only half on the digital figures flashing on his screen. The other half was in the living room, watching a ghost play a piano. For the rest of that day and the next, he found himself listening differently. The soft whisk of a broom on hardwood, the gentle clink of glassware being polished, these were no longer just the sounds of his home being maintained. They were the mundane soundtrack to a secret. He watched Maria, really watched her, for the first time in 3 years. He saw the careful, economical way she moved, the quiet focus in her eyes as she aligned books on a shelf or folded a towel with perfect corners. Her hands, now that he knew, seemed extraordinary even in their ordinary tasks. There was a precise grace to them. Whether they were arranging flowers or scrubbing a sink dot, it gnawed at him. The mystery was a splinter in his mind, impossible to ignore. He was a man who dealt in facts, in data, in clear agreements. This was a shadow, a silent performance in an empty room. He needed proof, not for anyone else, but for himself. He needed to know if that moment had been real, or some strange, sleep-deprived hallucination. The idea came to him on Wednesday night. Maria's next cleaning day was Friday. He stood in front of the grand piano, its lid still open like an invitation. On the polished wooden surface of the music stand, he placed a single heavy book. It was a collection of advanced piano etudes by a composer known for their fiendish difficulty. David didn't know music, but he knew complexity. He'd chosen this book from his shelf precisely because it looked intimidating, filled with dense forests of black notes. He opened it to a random, terrifying page and left it there got Friday morning arrived. He deliberately left the penthouse early, telling his assistant he'd be working from his club. But he didn't go to the club. He sat in a coffee shop across the street, watching the building's entrance through the rain-speckled window. Right on time, he saw her familiar figure arrive, umbrella in hand. He gave her an hour. When he returned, he used his key as silently as he could. The apartment was quiet, filled with the clean, lemony scent of polish. The vacuum cleaner was parked in a corner, switched off. He held his breath and walked to the living room door. The piano book was exactly where he left it. No, not exactly. The page was different. It had been turned. He approached, his heart doing a strange little thump against his ribs. He stared at the new page, another nightmare of musical notation. Had she turned it? Or had a draft? He was acting like a detective in a silly spy movie, and he felt a surge of frustration at his own foolishness. Then he had a second idea, a better one. This wasn't about catching her. It was about offering a door, however small, and seeing if she'd walk through. On the following Monday, he made a trip. Not to a boardroom, but to a dusty, cramped music store in the village, a place he'd passed 100 times and never seen. The old man behind the counter looked at him with surprise when David asked, not for something popular, but for something truly challenging, for a professional. The man's eyes lit up. He rummaged in a back room and returned with a few sheets of music, photocopied and bound simply. "This," the old man said, tapping the cover. "Ravel's Gaspard de l'Ennui. The third movement, Scarbo. It's one of the hardest pieces ever written for piano. A monster." David bought it. It looked insanely complicated, a storm of notes on the page. That night, he placed this new, ominous sheet music on the piano stand. Next to it, he left a small, high-quality digital audio recorder, the kind journalists use. It was a risk. It was an invasion. He knew it. But his curiosity was a physical ache now. He set it to record, pressed play, and left it hidden just behind the music book. The next day was not one of Maria's regular days. He had a different service come in for a deep clean. He stayed out all day, his mind churning. When he returned that evening, the apartment smelled of industrial cleaner. He went straight to the piano. The sheet music was there, but it had been moved. It was now neatly centered on the stand, the pages smooth flat. His heart leapt. He grabbed the audio recorder, his fingers fumbling as he rewound and pressed play. He heard the faint sounds of the other cleaning crew, first distant voices, the roar of a vacuum. Then a long stretch of silence. His disappointment began to solidify. Then a new sound. The soft creak of the living room door. A pause. The faint rustle of paper. And then music. It was different from the first piece. The Chopin had been a sorrowful song. This was something else entirely. It was dark, wild, and incredibly fast. It sounded like whispers and shrieks, like goblins dancing in shadows. The technical skill was mind-boggling notes cascading like waterfalls. Sudden, powerful crashes of sound, passages so quiet they were almost just a thought. It was chaotic, violent, and breathtakingly beautiful. It was the sound of a master wresting control from pure chaos. She played for maybe 4 minutes, just a fragment of the monstrous piece. Then it stopped abruptly. He heard a soft, frustrated sigh on the recording. A few more scattered notes, a stumble, a pause. Then the rustle of paper again, the gentle closing of the piano's key cover, and soft footsteps walking away. David listened to the 4-minute fragment 5 times in a row, sitting in the dark living room. The proof was undeniable. This wasn't just a woman who had taken lessons as a girl. This was a musician of the highest caliber, wrestling with a piece designed to challenge the very best. And she was doing it while pretending to be someone else. His approach changed. The detective work felt cheap now, underhanded. He felt a pang of shame for the hidden recorder. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved with tricks. It was a person with a story. He needed to meet her not as her employer catching her in an act, but as one human being recognizing another. He cleared his schedule for the next Friday. He told his assistant to hold all calls. He waited in his study, the door open, pretending to read a financial report he couldn't focus on. He heard her arrive, the soft click of the service entrance door, the familiar sounds of her starting her routine. He waited, letting her settle in. After about an hour, he heard it. The first tentative notes. They were softer today, a slow, wandering melody that sounded like a question. It was time. He stood up, his mouth suddenly dry. He walked to the doorway of the living room. She was there, her back to him, lost in the music, her shoulders moving gently. He didn't hide this time. He stepped into the room and cleared his throat softly. The music shattered. Her hands flew from the keys as if they were burning hot. She spun around on the bench, her face a mask of pure, unguarded terror. The color drained from her cheeks. She looked like a child caught stealing. Mr. Vance. She gasped, scrambling to her feet. Her hands twisted in her apron. I am so sorry. So very sorry. It is unforgivable. I will go. I understand. The words tumbled out, thick with her accent and heavy with fear. She was already moving toward the door, her head down, expecting the worst. Maria, wait, he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. He held up a hand, not to stop her, but in a gesture of peace. Please, don't go. She stopped, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the floor. Ashamed. He took a few steps into the room, careful to keep his distance. He gestured toward the piano. That, what you just played, and what I heard the other week, it's extraordinary. She finally glanced up, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She was looking for anger, for cold dismissal. She wasn't finding it. "I didn't mean to spy," he said, and it was mostly true. "I heard it by accident. But once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it." He paused, searching for the right words. "I left the music out, the difficult piece. I wanted to know if it was real." A fresh wave of shame seemed to wash over her. She understood now. The book, the sheet music. She wrapped her arms around herself. "It was you." He nodded. "It was me. I'm not angry, Maria. I'm stunned." He took another step closer, his own confusion and awe plain on his face. "Who are you? I mean, truly. How is this possible?" For a long moment, she said nothing. She just stood there, a woman caught between two worlds, the world of the polished apartment and the silent piano, and the world of the music that clearly lived and breathed inside her. The fear in her eyes slowly began to mix with something else, a deep, weary sadness. The wall she had built so carefully was cracking, and she was too tired, and too surprised by his gentle tone, to rebuild it. She looked from his face to the piano keys, and back again. A single tear escaped, tracing the same path it had that first morning he saw her. She didn't wipe it away. "It is," she whispered, the words so soft he had to lean in to hear them, "a very long story." The silence in the grand living room was thick now, but it was a different kind of quiet. The earlier shock had melted away, leaving behind a raw, fragile space. Maria stood by the piano, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the lid for support. David didn't move closer. He simply waited, giving her the room to breathe, to decide. She looked at the piano keys, a lifetime of feeling in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, the accent he was used to hearing in polite questions, now carrying the weight of a different world. "It was a very long time ago," she began, not looking at him. "In another life. My name, then, was Elizaveta." The name hung in the air, elegant and foreign. It suited the woman at the piano far more than Maria ever could. She took a slow breath, as if steadying herself to dive into deep water. "I grew up in Key. It was a different city then. My mother was a piano teacher. Our apartment was small, but we had an old, upright piano that took up half the living room. The sound was not beautiful like this one," she said, nodding toward the Steinway. "It was tinny, but to me, it was everything." A faint ghost of a smile touched her lips, gone as quickly as it came. "They said I had perfect pitch. I could play melodies I heard on the radio by the time I was 4. By 7, I was at the special music school. By 12, I was winning competitions. Not just in Ukraine. In Prague, in Vienna." Her eyes grew distant, seeing not the New York skyline but crowded concert halls from decades past. "They called me a prodigy. It was all I was. It was all I knew how to be." David listened, completely still. The financial reports, the meetings, all of it was a million miles away. It was a good life, in its way. Hard, 10, 12 hours of practice every day. But it was a path, a future. My parents, they sacrificed everything. My father worked 2 jobs. The dream was Paris, London, New York. She gestured vaguely around the penthouse. This, the stage. Not cleaning it. Her expression darkened. The memory turned painful. I was 19. I had just won a very big competition in Warsaw. An agent from London was interested. My hands. She looked down at them, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. My hands were insured. They were my fortune. She fell silent for a long moment, her jaw tight. That winter, My father became very sick. It was sudden. The doctors, the medicine. It was a bad time. Everything was difficult and expensive. My mother was beside herself. I was in Moscow for a special training, and I took a late-night train home to see him. Her voice grew thin. The train. There was an accident. Not a big one in the news, but enough. A jagged piece of metal from the compartment door. It cut here. She traced a long, faint line that ran along the side of her right palm, a pale scar David had never noticed. It severed tendons. It was. A butcher's job, the repair. In a small, crowded hospital. David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He could see it, the terrible, cruel symmetry of it. A future held in those hands, destroyed in a random, ugly moment. The surgery. It was not good. They told me I would regain basic function. And I did. She flexed her fingers slowly. I can hold a plate. I can polish wood. I can use a vacuum. But the subtlety, the speed, the independence of each finger, it was gone. The high-level technique, it was finished. I could play simple things, but the repertoire I lived for? It was a locked door. She said it with a flat finality that was worse than any tears. My father died 2 months later. The dream died with him, in a way. The money was gone. The agent in London stopped returning calls. Prodigies are not rare. There is always another one, with undamaged hands. Maria. I'm so sorry, David said, the words feeling completely inadequate. She acknowledged his sympathy with a small, tight nod, but she was lost in the past now. The story forcing its way out. My mother was broken. I had to work. I took any job. Playing piano in a silent movie theater, teaching spoiled children who did not want to learn. It was a humiliation. Every wrong note, every stumble was a scream reminding me of what I lost. So you left, David said softly. I met a man. An American. He was kind. He saw I was drowning, and he offered a rope, a way out, a fresh start. We married. He brought me here to New York. Her tone became practical, hollow. It was not a love story. It was a transaction. He wanted a wife. I wanted an escape. It was peaceful for a while. We had a son. He is my heart. But the marriage, it did not last. When my son was 10, his father left. There was no fight. It just ended. She finally looked at David, her eyes clear and unbearably tired. I was alone in a new country with a child. No real career. A music degree from Key meant nothing here. My hands could not do the one thing I was trained for, but they could clean. They could work. And cleaning, it pays cash. It is immediate. You do not need perfect English. You do not need to talk about your past. You show up, you work, you get paid. You feed your son. You keep a roof, a small apartment in Queens. That is what matters. She said it with a fierce, maternal pride that transformed her face. My son, he is in college now, engineering, a bright boy. He does not remember the music, not really. He knows I used to play. That is all. Her voice broke slightly. He begged me for years to play at home, but we could never afford a piano. And I did not want him to see the struggle, to hear the ghost of what should have been. It was easier to let it sleep. Her gaze drifted back to the Steinway. When I first came here, 3 years ago, and saw this, it was like seeing an old, dear friend who no longer recognizes you. For a year, I never touched it. Then, one day, everyone was gone. It was so quiet. And I just opened it. I played one scale. And for a minute, My hand did not hurt. For a minute, it did not matter. The music was still in here. She tapped her temple, then her chest. And in here, the connection to the keys, it was still there, even if the skill was less. It was a guilty pleasure, a secret. I would never play when anyone was home. I am so sorry. I know it was wrong. It wasn't wrong, David said, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised him. This instrument, it's meant to be played. It's been waiting for you. She shook her head, the practical housekeeper reasserting herself, pushing the vulnerability away. No, this is your home. I was hired to clean it, not to use it. It was a terrible lapse. I understand if you wish to terminate our agreement. David took a step forward, then stopped. He wasn't looking at his housekeeper anymore. He was looking at Elizaveta. He saw not an employee who had broken a rule, but an artist who had survived a shipwreck, clinging to the smallest piece of driftwood to stay afloat for someone else. Terminate? He said, almost laughing at the absurdity. Maria Elizaveta, I don't want to fire you. I want to understand. The piece you played from the sheet music I left, the incredibly hard one, you played it. Not perfectly, maybe, but you were fighting it, with a hand that was damaged. She looked at her scarred palm again. The left is okay. The right, it has limits. It gets stiff. The strength is not even. Some passages are impossible now. I play them in my head instead. She gave a small, resigned shrug. I try to solve the puzzle with what I have left. It is a different puzzle now. David stared at her. In that moment, he didn't see a tragedy. He saw the most formidable person he had ever met. A woman who had lost her entire identity, her dream, her country, her marriage, and had not crumbled. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, brick by brick, as a mother, a survivor. The music wasn't her failure. It was her phantom limb, a part of her that was gone, but still ached, and she was still trying to solve the puzzle. With what she had left, the cool, calculating part of his brain, the part that built fortunes, was already whirring. But it wasn't calculating profit. It was calculating possibility. It was looking at an undervalued, world-class asset, not of the financial markets, but of the human spirit. And it saw a profound, glaring wrong that needed to be made right. He had no idea how. But for the first time in a long time, a problem had nothing to do with money or deals. It had to do with a long, faint scar on a woman's hand, and the echoes of a piece she could no longer fully play. The question in the room was no longer, "Who are you?" It had become silently, for both of them, "What happens now?" The story had settled in the room like dust after a storm. The air felt clearer, but everything looked different. David watched Maria Elizaveta as she wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, a gesture that was both vulnerable and fiercely private. The housekeeper's armor was gone. In its place was a woman exposed, waiting for a verdict. He knew the next words out of his mouth were crucial. Pity would be a poison. Charity would be a wall between them. He had to be practical, but he had to make it make sense for her. "You said your son is in college," David began, his voice thoughtful. He walked slowly to the window, giving her space to collect herself. "Engineering. That's not cheap." She nodded, wary. "Yes, he has some scholarships. I help with the rest. And you do that by cleaning. How many houses a week?" "5," she said, her chin lifting slightly. It was a point of pride. "This is the largest." "5." He turned to face her. "And how many of those houses have a piano you'd even want to touch?" The question surprised her. She blinked. "None." "Right. So for 3 years, the only instrument you've been able to play is this one. And you only play it in stolen minutes, feeling like a thief. He paused, letting the truth of that sink in for both of them. That seems like a terrible waste. Of the piano. And of you. She shook her head, confusion knitting her brows. I do not understand what you are saying, Mr. Vance. He came back and sat on the edge of a low sofa, making himself smaller, less like the boss in his penthouse. I'm saying I want to make a new arrangement. A better one. You keep your job here. But the job changes. How? The single word was heavy with suspicion. She had heard promises before, long ago, that had turned to dust. First, the cleaning. We cut it back. Way back. You come once a week for a few hours, just for the basics. The heavy stuff, I'll have the other service handle. That frees up a day for you. A day for what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. For this. He gestured to the piano. Your new primary duty here is to be the pianist, the curator of this instrument. It's a machine. It needs to be played regularly to stay in perfect condition. Humidity, the felt, the strings. It's all technical. He was making it up as he went along, but it sounded plausible. I'm paying for its maintenance anyway. Having you play, it is the best maintenance it can get. She stared at him, utterly baffled. You want to pay me? To play the piano? I want to pay you for your time and expertise, yes, which you were giving away for free in secret. Now it's part of the job. An important part. She let out a short, disbelieving breath. It sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no joy in it. Mr. Vance, that is? Kind, but it is a fantasy. Playing for an empty room is not a job. And my hands, they are not what they were. You heard the mistakes. I heard someone fighting, he corrected her, his tone firm. I heard someone solving a complex problem with limited tools. That's a skill I value more than anything. He leaned forward. Here's the second part. You said the surgery was bad. That was years ago. Medicine changes. Therapies change. What if you could get some of that function back? Not all, maybe, but more? A flicker of something hope. Fear crossed her face before she shut it down. That is for young athletes. Not for a cleaning woman. That's where you're wrong, he said. He stood up, his mind racing now, clicking into the mode of building a deal. I have a friend. Well, a contact. He's on the board of the Performing Arts School. He knows everyone in the music world here. The best teachers, the best physical therapists for musicians. What if I could arrange for you to see someone? Not as a patient, but as a research project. A fascinating case. A musician who needs to retrain. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. He could see the war inside her. The part that wanted to shout yes, and the part that had been bruised too many times to believe it. Why? She asked, the question simple and direct. Why would you do this? It is not your problem. David was quiet for a long moment. He looked around his pristine, silent, multi-million-dollar apartment. Because this place has everything, and it has no soul. That music you played, it had soul. It's the first real thing I've heard in here, in years. And because, he met her eyes, I've spent my life finding things that are undervalued and unlocking their potential. It's what I do. And seeing talent like yours locked away, it offends my professional sensibilities. Let's call it a personal investment. He could tell she was starting to consider it, the practical mother weighing the risks. My son, I cannot risk my income. It is not just for me. Your base pay stays the same, David said quickly. Exactly the same. The only thing that changes is what you do, earn it. Less cleaning, more music. The lessons, the therapy, that would be covered separately. A grant from a cultural fund. He invented it on the spot. She was silent, thinking it over. The fear was still there, but a new, fragile curiosity was pushing through. Who would this teacher be? I don't know yet, but someone good. Someone who respects the craft, not just the fame. He had an idea. What if the first meeting was just a conversation? No playing, unless you wanted to. Just to talk. No obligations. You could walk away. The safety of that away out seemed to relax her shoulders a fraction. She walked slowly to the piano and let her fingertips brush the cool, smooth wood of its side. It was a lover's touch. My son would think I am crazy, she murmured. But there was a hint of warmth in her voice now. Tell him your boss is eccentric, David offered, a small smile touching his lips. It's true. She turned to look at him, really studying him for the first time. She was looking for the trap, the hidden catch, the cruelty behind the kindness. She saw a man who was slightly awkward, intensely curious, and clearly out of his depth in this emotional territory, but trying anyway. Just a conversation? She confirmed. Just a conversation? He nodded. She took a deep, slow breath, her gaze fixed on the piano keys. It was as if she was seeing a door she had boarded up long ago, and someone was offering to help her pry off the first nail. Okay, she said, the word so soft he almost missed it. Then stronger. Okay, I will meet this person. For a conversation. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The following Thursday, David's contact came through. The teacher's name was Mr. Pavlovich. He was older, from the old Russian school, and he taught only a handful of advanced students out of a small, book-crammed studio at the Performing Arts School. David had described the situation vaguely. A talented pianist from the old country, with an injury, who had been away from serious study for many years. David drove Maria there himself. She sat in the passenger seat of his car, stiff as a statue, clutching her purse. She wore her best simple dress. She looked terrified. Remember, David said as they stood outside the studio door, just talk. You don't have to play a note. This is just to see if there's a fit. She nodded, unable to speak. She opened the door and went in. David waited in the hallway on an uncomfortable wooden bench. He could hear the low murmur of voices through the door. Then silence. A long, long silence. His stomach tightened. Had he pushed her into a humiliation? Then a single note rang out, clear and pure. Then a scale, slow and careful. Then a stop. More murmured conversation. Then the beginnings of a piece. It was halting, stumbling. He heard Maria stop, her voice frustrated. He heard the low, calm rumble of the teacher's voice. An hour later, the door opened. Maria emerged, her eyes red-rimmed, but shining with a light David had never seen before. Mr. Pavlovich followed, a serious man with bushy white eyebrows. He looked at David. You did not tell me she was Elizaveta Mitrofanova, he said, his accent thick. I heard her compete in '91. She was a storm. Maria looked at the floor, a blush on her cheeks. Mr. Pavlovich turned to her. The hand is a problem. A big problem. The technique is buried, rusty. It will be very hard work. It will be painful. You will be angry with me. He paused, his stern face softening just a fraction. But the music is still there. In the heart, in the head. We can try to find a new road for it to reach the keys. A different road. He looked at David. 1 lesson a week. We will see. On the drive back, Maria was quiet. Then, as the city blurred past her window, she spoke. He gave me exercises. For my hand. And a new piece to think about. Not Ravel, something slower. More about color than speed. She flexed her right hand slowly, looking at it not with hatred, but with a scientist's focus. He said it will never be what it was. But it can be. Something else. She turned to David, and for the first time, she offered him a real, small, tearful smile. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't a servant thanking a boss. It was one person thanking another for seeing a crack of light and helping to open the door. The arrangement had begun. The penthouse entered a new rhythm. The relentless, silent perfection was replaced by something far more interesting, a process. The soundtrack to David's days was no longer just the hum of the city. Some mornings, it was the slow, stubborn repetition of a single, difficult passage, played over and over. Other times, it was the quiet swish of a cloth as Maria, true to the new arrangement, still gave the grand piano a meticulous cleaning, a ritual of care that now felt more like a greeting to an old friend. David kept his distance, mostly. He didn't hover. He'd work in his study, the door open, letting the sounds of her struggle and occasional triumph drift in. He heard frustration in the hard slam of a lid, followed by silence. He heard the quiet, muttered curses in her native tongue. More than once, he walked past the living room to see her sitting with her eyes closed, her right hand in her left, slowly, painfully stretching the fingers. Her face a mask of concentration that it wasn't a fairy tale. There were no miracles. Some days she seemed defeated, the shadows under her eyes darker. "The hand does not listen today," she'd say simply, and she would clean instead, the movements sharp with suppressed anger. Mr. Pavlovich was, as promised, a demanding taskmaster. He gave her not glittering concertos, but simple, profound pieces by composers like Satie and Debussy, music that demanded color and feeling over blinding speed. It was a language she had to relearn with a new, clumsy alphabet. After about 6 months, David noticed a change. The stumbling was less frequent. The phrases had more shape, more confidence. One afternoon, he heard a piece that made him stop in the hallway. It was familiar, the same Chopin nocturne she'd played that first morning. But it was different. The sorrow was still there, but it wasn't raw pain anymore. It was a story told with wisdom, with layers. It was more beautiful than he remembered. He knew then that she was ready. Not for a concert hall, but for an audience. An audience of one, maybe two, who would understand what they were hearing. He approached her one Friday. "I was thinking of having a few people over next month. A small dinner. Some music lovers. A friend who runs a music school. A couple of critics who owe me favors." He kept his tone casual. "I was wondering if he'd be willing to play a few pieces. Just as the resident musician. A private performance." Her face went pale. "For critics? No, Mr. Vance, no. I am not ready for that. They will hear only the mistakes, the limits. They'll hear Elizaveta," he said firmly. "They'll hear the story in the music. That's what matters. Not technical perfection. You're not a 19-year-old prodigy anymore. You're something better. You're a musician who has lived." She refused for a week. Then she asked, tentatively, who exactly would come. He told her the names, 2 respected, older critics known for their deep knowledge. Not for cruelty, and the head of a small, prestigious music academy. "And my son," she said, her voice suddenly strong. "I would want my son to be there." "Of course," David said, smiling. "He should be the guest of honor." Asterisk, 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 the evening arrived. The penthouse was softly lit, the dining table set for 8. The guests arrived, curious about David's mysterious artist in residence. Maria's son came, a tall, serious young man in a slightly too big suit, looking around the luxurious apartment with wide, uncertain eyes. He hugged his mother tightly, a confused pride on his face. Maria was a nervous ghost in a simple, dark blue dress David had quietly arranged for. She barely spoke, just hovered by the piano, Running a cloth over the already spotless keys, over and over dot after dinner, David stood. Thank you all for coming. Many of you know I have no musical talent myself, but I've been lucky to discover that I have a musician living right here. She has been kind enough to agree to share some music with us tonight. Her name is Elizaveta. He said no more. There was no tragic backstory offered, no tale of maids and millionaires. The story was to be in the music. Everyone moved to the living room. Maria's son sat on the edge of an armchair, leaning forward. Maria walked to the piano. She didn't look at the small audience. She looked at the keys, took a breath that seemed to steady the whole room, and began. She played 3 pieces. The first was the Sati, Nacien No One. It was spare, haunting, and hypnotic. The silence between the notes was as important as the notes themselves. The critics, who had been leaning back politely, slowly sat up. The second was a short lyrical piece by a Ukrainian composer David didn't know. It was a folk melody, full of longing for a distant place. Maria's face softened as she played it, a private memory flashing across her features. Her son watched her, his earlier confusion melting into something like awe. He was seeing a stranger, and yet it was his mother. For the final piece, she turned to the guests. Her voice was quiet, but clear. This is by Chopin. It is a story of farewell. She turned back. It was the nocturne, the one that had started it all. But now, played for an audience who was listening, truly listening, it transformed. Every ounce of her journey was in it. The lost girl from Kiev, the pain of the injury, the years of quiet labor, the rediscovery of a bruised but unbroken love. You could hear the stiff hand finding a way, not around the difficulty, but through it, making the emotion deeper for the struggle. When the last note faded, there was no applause at first. Just a deep, collective silence, a moment of respect for something real that had just been shared. Then the sound began, not wild clapping, but slow, sincere. From people who knew they had witnessed something rare. The critics came to her, not with pats on the back, but with questions. Your phrasing? The left hand carries such melody. How did you approach this section? They spoke to her as a peer. The Academy director, a sharp-eyed woman, listened, watching Maria's hands as she spoke. David hung back, watching. He saw Maria's son approach her. He saw her reach out and take his hand, her damaged musician's hand holding the strong engineering student's hand. She didn't say anything to him. She just held on, her eyes full of tears, but her smile radiant. He was seeing her, finally, completely. Not just as the mother who cleaned and worried, but as the artist she had kept hidden to protect him, and to protect herself. Later, as the guests were leaving, the Academy director lingered with David by the door. She's remarkable, the director said quietly. The technique is, of course, a work in progress. But the musicality, the soul of it, you cannot teach that. We have a program, a residency for artist educators who have taken unconventional paths. It's part-time, teaching motivated advanced students, giving the occasional salon performance. It comes with a stipend. It's not fame. It's a community. I think she would be perfect. Would she be interested? David looked across the room. Maria was showing her son the intricate workings of the Steinway's open lid, pointing to the hammers and strings, her voice animated. She was in her element. I think, David said, you should ask her yourself. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A few weeks later, the change was official. Maria cut her cleaning jobs down to 2, for longtime clients she didn't want to abandon. 2 days a week, she took the subway to the music academy, a tote bag full of scores instead of cleaning supplies. She had a small, sunlit studio there to practice and teach. She still came to the penthouse every Friday. The arrangement had shifted organically. She would play for an hour or two new pieces she was working on, or old favorites. Sometimes David would listen. Sometimes he'd just work nearby, the music a companion. Afterwards, they would often share a pot of tea. They talked about music, about her students, about his work. It was an unexpected, quiet friendship built on a foundation of a shared secret. One Friday, she finished playing a new piece, something modern and challenging. She flexed her right hand with a wince, then a smile. "Still hurts?" David asked, bringing over her tea. "Always," she said, accepting the cup. "But now it is a good hurt. It means I am using it. It means it is alive." She looked at the piano, then at him. "You gave me back a piece of myself I had buried. Not the career I lost. That is gone. But the music. The right to call myself a musician." David shook his head. "I didn't give you anything. I just opened a door you were too proud and too scared to walk through yourself. You did the walking." She sipped her tea, the city lights twinkling behind her. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling with a hint of their old, secret mischief, "that first day when I played the ravel for your recorder, I knew." David paused. "Knew what?" "I knew you had left it there. I saw it." She smiled at his surprised expression. "I played it anyway. A very small, rebellious part of me wanted to be caught." He laughed, a real, warm laugh that filled the quiet room. The millionaire and the musician sat in easy silence. The grand piano between them no longer a question, but a bridge, a testament to the stunning things that can happen when someone is truly seen, and a buried psalm is finally allowed to be heard.